Hey everyone, and welcome to our video on plant responses to the environment. This is part of Module 5, Section 5, and that's the module where we're going to be having a look at all the different plant and animal responses. What we'll be looking at in this video are specification references 5.1.5a Part 1, the types of plant responses, and 5.1.5b, the role of plant hormones. So first thing we need to understand then are the different types of stimuli that plants might encounter. And the external stimuli that a plant might encounter would be either biotic or abiotic. And hopefully those words are familiar to us from our GCSE. So biotic are generally those living factors and abiotic are the non-living factors, if we remember. So one of the types of stimulus that a plant is going to have to respond to is herbivory. Now, herbivory is basically where those plants are going to be eaten by some kind of an animal. Okay, so herbivory is basically where our plants are being eaten by a creature of some form. Now, in terms of how our plant is going to respond to this herbivory, then this quite frequently is achieved through producing certain chemicals. And these chemicals are going to do one of two things. They're either going to be some kind of chemical that's going to repel the herbivore, maybe by being a certain taste or smell, etc., that means they don't want to go near it, or they're just going to be poisonous to it. And let's be honest, if you eat something that's poisonous, you're probably not going back for seconds. Now, in terms of when these chemicals are present, some are present all the time, and others will only be produced in response to some form of stress. So basically what we're looking at there is maybe an animal started nibbling on the plant, and as a response, the plant is then going to produce this chemical to deter that creature. So, first example of one of our chemicals that we may see, tannins. Now, tannins are something that you will have encountered if you drink tea, and let's be honest, we're British, most of you probably have drunk tea at least once in your life. So tannins are water-soluble carbon compounds, and these are stored inside the vacuole of those plant cells. And we tend to find them in the upper epidermis in leaves. So if we think about the upper epidermis, that's obviously the bit that's most likely to come into contact with a range of those potential herbivorous creatures. So the tannins themselves have this quite bitter taste, and when an animal then tries to eat that plant, they get a mouthful of bitter chemical instead, and that pretty much puts them off from wanting to continue their little tasty treat on those leaves. If we consider small organisms like our little microorganisms, then they're actually toxic. So these tannins are actually going to be quite a deterrent to microorganisms because generally speaking they avoid those organisms where they're producing those toxic compounds. And same can be true of larger herbivores, that consuming these tannins in large quantities can also be quite toxic to them, give them general upsets that mean they don't want to go back. Second type of chemical are the alkaloids. Now, alkaloids are nitrogenous compounds derived from amino acids. And again, they've got this bitter taste and they can be toxic to other living organisms. These ones tend to be found in the growing tips, in flowers, and in those peripheral layer of cells in stems and roots. And remember, peripheral is basically the edge. So what we tend to find is those particularly little tasty morsels, the little tips that are growing, the flowers, and the bits that are likely to come into contact with creatures planning to munch on a plant around the edge of those stems and roots, they've got these alkaloids present, which means, again, when they take a little nibble, they're going to get that bitter taste and be put off from continuing to attack that plant. So we've got three examples of these alkaloids. Some of these are going to be quite familiar to you, I expect. Caffeine. So obviously caffeine is in a huge range of drinks, and this is actually quite toxic to insects and fungi, so quite a good deterrent for those organisms. We have nicotine, hopefully something you're not as familiar with based on health standards, but nicotine is a neurotoxin and that can actually be fatal to insects, so clearly they're going to keep their distance. And then capsaicin. This is something you probably are aware of and possibly consumed. it's actually that stuff that's in sort of spicy peppers and things like this. And this is going to give you that burning sensation. So the same idea, if you really spicy peppers, you get that kind of burning feeling in your mouth. Same idea here. By having that chemical present within the plants, herbivores get that feeling. They generally don't want to eat them. Humans seem to be the only oddities where we like to basically burn our mouths with food for some reason. We then come on to pheromones, and you may well have heard about these in terms of being used in mating and things like this in organisms. Now, pheromones are chemicals that are made and released by one member of a species, and they are going to actually affect the physiology and behaviour of another organism. So quite clearly, if plants are able to release these pheromones that have an impact on another organism, changing their behaviour, etc., it can act as a pretty good deterrent. We then have another one that's toxic to insects, and those are the oxides of ethene, and hopefully we remember that ethene is one of those important plant hormones. Ethene is also going to be important because it controls other chemical defences in the plants, and it can do this by switching on particular genes that are going to then produce other chemicals that deter those insects that could be about to cause damage to the plant itself. So we've had a look at these different types of stimuli and of course some of the chemicals that our plants can utilise, but we now need to delve a little bit deeper into the types of responses that plants can use in response to these different stimuli. And what we're looking at are things called tropisms. Wherever you see that word tropism, it's literally talking about growth in response to a stimulus. That's all it means. Now, we'll be able to divide these tropisms up into both positive and negative tropisms. A positive tropism is where the growth is going towards the stimulus, and negative tropisms, it's going away from the stimulus. So make sure you remember which way is positive and which way is negative, because you can then apply that to whichever type of tropism we may be discussing. So first, and hopefully most familiar tropism, phototropism. And if we break that word down, we obviously have our two parts to it: photo referring to light, and the tropism is obviously that growth in response to light. So what we're seeing here is that things like the shoots of a plant are actually going to be growing towards the light, so that obviously they get greater light intensity to maximise the rate of photosynthesis. So the shoots are going to demonstrate positive phototropism. Positive because it's growing towards the stimulus of the light, phototropism because it is growth in response to light. Second type of tropism you should have met at GCSE is geotropism. Now, geotropism is the response to gravity, and this is obviously going to be important so that when our seeds are germinating, they know which way the shoots should go and which way the roots should go. So shoots show negative geotropism because remember, it's the response to gravity, and gravity always acts towards the centre of the earth. So our shoots are going to be aiming basically up into the air. That's their goal in life, and therefore it's going to be negative geotropism because it's the opposite direction to gravity's direction. Roots, however, are going to show that positive geotropism because they're growing in the same direction as gravity. The next one, possibly not familiar to us pre-A level, is chemotropism. Now, we already know tropism is growth in response to a stimulus. The stimulus is chemo, and chemo refers to chemicals. So what we're seeing here is how a plant is going to grow in response to a particular chemical. And one of the best examples of this that you might have met lower down the school is looking at that process of fertilisation in our plants. When the pollen grain actually lands on the stigma, what happens is we get these little pollen tubes that need to grow down to the ovary. So obviously those pollen tubes need to know where to grow. So that's all to do with chemicals directing them down, obviously the style, to the ovary so that they can then fertilise those eggs. Next type of tropism is thigmotropism. Now, thigmotropism is a response to touch, And yes, plants do have the ability to sense touch. And we find this is particularly important in any of these climbing plants, so things like ivy, etc. Because what those climbing plants have got to do is work out where the thing they can attach to actually is. So that's obviously going to let them detect that bit they're going to attach onto or support themselves with, and then put their little structures to curl around it and adhere to that surface. We then come on to something called nastic movement, and this is a non-directional response. Now, nastic movement is basically where we're going to see some kind of a movement in our plant in response to a bioelectrical signal, not plant hormones in this case. And the best example of where we see this is in a little plant called Mimosa pudica, and this is it down in the bottom corner here. And the thing with our little Mimosa pudica is that if you touch the leaf of Mimosa pudica, then all of these little leaflets, which are these little structures around the leaf here, what's going to happen is they're all going to fold in really quickly. So all the cells at the base of each leaflet are going to take up water really quickly and therefore expand. The cells that are adjacent to them lose water and collapse, and that creates that folding movement. So we go from this very spread out leaf structure to something where all those little leaflets are very closely folded inwards. And the big advantage of this is if we're just doing that in response to that moment of touch there, what it's likely to do is if there is a herbivore wandering around that might be about to nibble on that plant, that moment of touch sends that little bioelectrical signal into the plant, and as a result is going to fold that leaf in, making it look less appetizing. Because at the end of the day, once it's all folded in, it just looks like a narrow stick. And generally, chewing on a stick, not as appealing as a nice green juicy leaf. Now, one thing we do need to remember is that our plants are actually quite complex little things. I know some people seem to think that they're really quite dull, but they're not. Plants are actually really quite fascinating organisms. And when we're considering all of these different things that a plant has to do, it still needs coordination. So what we find is our plants are going to use hormones to coordinate their responses to these external stimuli. And those hormones can be produced by a range of different tissues in the plant, and they work in a similar way to the hormones in us as animals. They're going to be produced by tissue, reach the target cells, bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane, and then trigger effects in those cells to bring about the response that was desired. So let's have a look at some of these examples of key plant hormones that we should be aware of for A-level biology. First one is one we have heard about back in GCSE, auxins. Now at GCSE we talked about auxin as if it was a singular chemical. It's not. It's a family of hormones in reality. And one of these is a substance called IAA, indole 3-acetic acid. You don't have to remember the full name, IAA, fine. And IAA is all about promoting that cell elongation through stimulating these expansins that exist in the cell wall. And as the name expansin suggests, these are ones that are obviously going to be able to expand, and that's what causes the cell elongation. Now, that's what we looked at in terms of GCSE as far as auxin went. We said that they make cells elongate, but they also do other things. The auxins are also going to have a role in inhibiting the growth of these side shoots, and we term this as causing apical dominance. Now, this phrase apical dominance just means that we're basically going to see the plant growing upwards rather than branching outwards. So when we've got these auxins present, we're inhibiting the side shoots and it's growing vertically instead, that apical dominance. Another role of our auxins is they can inhibit leaf abscission, and leaf abscission is basically where the leaves fall off the trees. Now, what we find is that the auxins will be made by young leaves, and as a result, they make that leaf insensitive to the ether. The second plant hormone we should be aware of are the gibberellins. And gibberellins are ones that we did find out about at GCSE, at least briefly, and we said they promote seed germination. but they also help with stem growth and flowering. So what we actually find is the gibberellins are going to be working with auxins. And what we're going to see here is these two hormones work together to stimulate the growth of the stem. So the gibberellins stimulate cell elongation and promote the cell division, and the auxins, as we've already said, are going to promote that cell elongation. So those two hormones working together lead to growth of the stem there. In terms of how they promote this seed germination, then inside our seed, what we actually have are obviously stores of starch. That's how our seed is going to have energy reserves ready for respiration when germination time is there. So these gibberellins actually produce amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down starch, and that means when we've got that gibberellin present, we produce the amylase breaks down the starch. That means we now have glucose ready for obviously respiration, providing the energy for all of those processes for the plant to grow. The next one is something called abscisic acid, or ABA, and this is all to do with closing the stomata. And hopefully we remember from our GCSE, the stomata are basically little pores on our plants which are going to allow carbon dioxide to enter, but also the loss of water vapour. We obviously don't want the stomata to be open at all times, therefore we need a control mechanism. So the ABA has a role in this closure of those stomata. And what we find is it's going to be produced in the roots of plants when there's a decreased water potential in the soil. So basically what we're seeing there is, in that scenario where our plant is going to be experiencing limited supplies of water coming in because the soil is drying up, then the roots detect it, they produce this ABA, that is then going to be translocated up to the leaves where the stomata are, and it's going to bind to receptors on the guard cell membranes, leading to the closure and therefore reducing that loss of water from our plant. And the way it does this is that once it's actually bound onto those receptors on the guard cell membranes, then we get a little series of events that take place, with the end result of the calcium channels opening. So calcium ions are then going to enter the guard cells, potassium, nitrate and chloride ions are going to leave the cell, and as a result of this, the water potential will increase. So if we've increased our water potential, water then moves by osmosis to the surrounding cells, and that means the guard cells are less turgid because obviously water has moved out by osmosis. As a result of them being less turgid, then they close, and that means the stomata is going to be closed. We've already said that the gibberellins are actually going to promote seed germination by obviously triggering the release of this amylase. ABA has the opposite role. It actually inhibits the germination of seeds by inhibiting the production of amylase. So at those points where the seeds shouldn't be germinating, this ABA would be present and it inhibits that production of amylase and therefore prevents the seed germinating when it shouldn't do. The final hormone we're going to look at is ethene, and ethene was again one we mentioned at GCSE to do with the ripening of fruit. Now there are other roles that ethene has, and the first one is it promotes leaf abscission. So we've already said that auxins are going to actually inhibit the leaf abscission, but ethene promotes it. And the way it does so is it actually stimulates the breakdown of the cell walls in what we call the abscission layer that's at the base of the leaf stalk. So basically if you've got your little plant, so we'll draw a lovely little plant, then we've got our little leaf sticking off here, there we go, honestly that's a leaf. And what we've got is a little abscission layer at the base here. Now what we're going to see is that we're going to break down the cell walls down at this part, and as a result our leaf is then going to fall to the ground. So obviously this is going to be an important part of the life cycle of these deciduous plants, because when the conditions are not favourable, think winter in the UK, then we obviously need to minimise the amount of living tissue that requires inputs and therefore some kind of survival. So what we're going to see is those deciduous plants drop their leaves at that point of the year where they're not going to be able to get enough light for photosynthesis to produce all the sugars, etc., that it needs to keep all those bits alive. And so ethene promotes that leaf abscission, the leaves then drop, and that means the plant can survive through that unfavourable condition. As always, I hope you found today's video useful, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see when the next video is uploaded, and head on over to the website to see a range of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.